Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another Fundy Fridays interview. And I cannot tell you how excited we are about this one in particular today. We've been on a good run here at Fundy Fridays getting like legitimate field leading experts for interviews. And today is no exception. With us today is Dr. Lucas Wilson. I don't even want to jump into your specialty because I feel like I'm not going to do it the proper justice. I feel like you'll be the one to explain it. But before I say that, just thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for being here. Should I say Dr. Wilson or should I say Luke?
You call me whatever you want. Just don't call me late for supper, James.
Oh,
Okay?
I won't do that because Lord knows I ain't either. Well, Dr. Wilson recently edited a compilation of incredible short stories. The collection is titled Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. Luke, would you be so kind as to just give us a bit, I know this is broad, but just give us a bit of an overview of this collection and the work you do that led into creating such a thing like this?
Yeah, so the book is a collection of 17 stories about conversion therapy written by conversion therapy survivors. And, the authors range from anywhere along the LGBTQ plus spectrum. And they're from Australia, from Canada, from the US. And most of the stories are in religious contexts, right? So it's mostly evangelical and white Christian fundamentalist. But there are other stories included as well. There's one story from a secular context. There's one story from an Orthodox Jewish context, and there's one story from what the author describes as a Chinese cult.
And that is better than I could have ever explained it. I recently got the chance to take a look at the book and read through it. Unbelievable. So for those in our audience now, obviously the Fundy Fridays audience is pretty well up on a lot of this type of stuff, but we also don't know where people are coming from, and this whole conversion therapy thing is very big and very nebulous. It's much more nebulous than a lot of people think it is. That was something I learned from your collection, was that it looks very different than people may think. So could you potentially explain the concept of conversion therapy in kind of a beginner friendly way, just in case we have some folks out there who've never heard of this practice?
Yeah, so conversion therapy is the attempt to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity and or expression. So it's looking at queerness as a disorder. It's looking at queerness as a disease. It's looking at queerness as an addiction. It's looking at queerness in pejorative, negative terms, right? And so it's predicated on homophobic and transphobic, thinking, and it's predicated on the idea that one is not queer, but one is ultimately a latent heterosexual. That through certain practices, through certain conversion practices, that individual will become or actualize their heterosexuality, or at least their heteronormativity, which then leads, according to this thinking, to heterosexuality. So it's really pushing people in a lot of contexts to change how they present themselves gender-wise, because according to conversion therapy ideology, if one is to change one's gender identity and expression, for me, when I was a young gay boy, I loved to play with my sister's dolls. I loved to play, playing with her makeup, eating her makeup, whatever. And I was like that messy kid with like the orange pop mustache. Anyway, so this is, I was, as a young boy, not aligning with what it meant to be, a stereotypical boy in a lot of senses. And because of that, according to this thinking, I was living in the world of girls. And I was living in, sort of the feminine, capital F feminine, sphere of existence. And what I needed to do, according to this thinking, again, I always have to say according to this thinking, because people always think that I'm saying this and that I believe this. So according to conversion ideology, that for a young gay boy, he's living, contrary to his, proper gender. And by the time, a young gay boy, and we can use a young gay boy as the example and myself as the example, when I hit puberty, according to, my conversion therapist and conversion ideology in general, I was going to go through what was opposite of me. Because again, within this world, it's very much this binary understanding of gender, binary understanding of really everything. But since I was, living in the world of girls, when I got to puberty, I became attracted to what was opposite of me, which would have been, according to this, again, thinking, men, boys. And, then once I, passed puberty and I started, to habituate my, again, well, I guess I'd been, according I say according to this thinking like 3,000 times, and I'll try not to anymore.
I will say, we know this is not, you don't believe in any of this stuff. The researcher, you submerge yourself in a culture that you don't always appreciate, and we appreciate you for it, because all the research you have done has protected us from having to do this type of thing. Although you're hitting on a question I wanted to ask, which was with your own personal experience.
So conversion therapy is the attempt to change an individual's sexual orientation and or gender identity and or gender expression. And so really this ideology is situated in a binary understanding of the world, masculine, feminine, of God, of the enemy, blah, blah, blah. And obviously not all conversion practices happen within religious context, but most at this point do. In fact, the large majority of conversion practices actually are happening in religious context. So conversion therapy is looking at, again, this idea that an individual's sexual orientation, if that person's queer, if a person's gender identity or expression is non-normative, right? So if they're trans, or if they're non-binary, if they're not, aligning with the heteronormative sort of model, it's that this gender identity and expression and sexual orientation need to change. Why? Because they're defective, because they're, queerness is understood as an addiction. Queerness is understood as a pathology. Queerness is understood in really pejorative, negative terms. And ultimately, according to this thinking, you have to change to align with what it means to be, a stereotypical man and a stereotypical woman. And part of that stereotypical understanding of, men and women is that they're straight. So conversion therapy ultimately argues that an individual is able to change. Why? Because all people, regardless of how they identify, are latent heterosexuals. And that for those of us who are queer, we just quote unquote struggle with same-sex attraction, right? So it's a way of divorcing the individual from the identity and also just from, reality. But they say this, that ultimately folks need to change how they are performing their gender in order to ultimately change their orientation, if in fact what they're trying to change is their orientation. Because again, some people go into conversion therapy because they're trans and because they, are struggling with their gender identity. So this thinking is really just pushing people to align with a certain heteronormative model, to perform a certain brand of masculinity or femininity. And the operative word there is really to perform, right? So conversion therapy is pushing people to act, again, in a very literal sense, like something that they're not, in order to align with, again, the heteronormative model. Of course, the problem is that just because you're acting like something doesn't mean that you are something. But according to this thinking, over time, if you habituate a certain gender performance, you will in turn change how you not only identify gender-wise, but also how you identify sexually. So for me as a young gay boy, right, when I was a kid, according to this ideology, I was living really in the world of girls, and I wasn't, aligning with what it meant to be a real boy. And again, a real boy does, play sports and, does, karate, or I don't know. You can tell how far out of that world I am. Like karate, is that right? And so because I was not living again in the world of boys, I was again really connecting with what it meant to be feminine, and I was again, at least in their estimation, very feminine. And so this ideology says that once you hit puberty, you go for what's opposite of you. And again, if this is a binary understanding of the world, what was opposite of me was that, we're boys. And so I became, again, according to this thinking, attracted to boys. And so what conversion therapy teaches is that then after you've hit puberty and after you've, again, found attraction to the same sex, or what was opposite of me, which was boys, or then men, is that you're habituating this gender performance, and then in turn, you are attracted to, again, the same sex. So the way to fix this and the way to correct this, according to conversion ideology, is that you are to perform a certain brand of masculinity, if you're a gay, man, that aligns with, again, the heteronormative model. So they push you to perform, they push you to, again, be inauthentic and really, to act according to the stereotypical model. And then what happens is that you're not only just going to act like a man, you're then going to in turn be a man, right? So if you're not just performing, whether you go to church and you say, hey, so-and-so, I did you watch the Leafs game last night? If you're in Toronto, or if you, whatever sport, insert sport here. You then start talking about sports, you start playing sports, you start doing things, you do carpentry. I was always pushed to do carpentry, which I find very funny. It's like very Jesus of my conversion therapist. I was like, you want me to do woodwork? I don't think you know what you're asking. But, and so they push you to, again, do stereotypical things. Then over time, you're not just doing stereotypical things, you are becoming that stereotype, you are becoming masculine. And then you change your gender identity, and in turn, your sexuality changes over time as well. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy, particularly in a religious context. And again, most of the stories included in same-sex attraction are from religious contexts. And again, not all conversion therapy happens within churches or, ministries or whatever, but the vast majority do. And so that's why I offer this focus or this sort of understanding of conversion therapy, because it's most prevalent, at least in the US, Canada, and well, actually most of the world.
That is about as thorough as we could ask for. Thank you so much for that. One thing I did want to highlight too, just because I like to switch nomenclature when it seems appropriate. And one thing I really liked at the beginning of the collection, because I will also highlight that Luke is not just the editor of Same-Sex Attraction. He is also a contributor to the collection, contributing 2 stories, the end caps, as I would call them, the beginning and the end. And I loved in your introduction in particular that you highlighted that the nomenclature of conversion therapy has changed somewhat, and that academics, people in your position who study the topic, are shifting to what, as I recall, it was conversion practices. Yeah. Normally, I like to highlight these nomenclature changes when they have some real important thing to say, or there's a really important reason that was changed. And based on what you wrote, I feel like that's the case here. Can you explain to our audience why the nomenclature around conversion therapy is starting to move towards conversion practice?
So there are multiple reasons why the language is changing. In part, and I always say this about evangelicalism, is that we have to put everything in quotation marks, right? Like conversion therapy, like everything needs quotation marks and double quotes and triple, anyway. So part of it is that this is not therapy, right? The conversion therapy is a misnomer. It's also not conversion. There's no actual change that's happening other than how people are, again, acting or performing. But part of the change is that this isn't therapy. Another reason is that I think a lot of people have a very particular understanding of what they think of when they think of conversion therapy, right? And oftentimes we think of, it's in a pastor's office or in a church basement or in some like crackpot, unlicensed therapist's office. The reality is that happens in a lot of contexts and it comes in a lot of forms, right? And so conversion practices is a broader term that conversion therapy is certainly under. And again, all of what I described, like, in pastor's offices, in unlicensed therapist's office, these are definitional examples of conversion therapy or conversion practices, but there are a lot more practices, right? And I think that when we think of conversion practices in a broader sense, it is more helpful for a few reasons. One, it's not sort of, essentializing only one experience as conversion therapy. Again, there are multiple experiences. The other part I think that's super important is that although not everyone went through conversion therapy, I would say that every single queer person and a number of straight people have undergone conversion practices, right? And so this, I can use the example of, and I oftentimes use the example of when, a parent says to, his or her child, if it's a little boy, like, uncross your legs, you look like a girl. Little girl, like, you shouldn't be, playing with boys' toys, whatever. And then this messaging that a lot of young queer people receive over their lifetime, it accumulates, right? And they've received this message that I shouldn't be acting this way, I shouldn't be talking this way, I shouldn't be doing these activities, I shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z. And the thing is that these are all conversion practices, whether they're implicit or explicit, whether they're, overt or covert. And I think that for every little queer kid in the world, we've all received, these messages over our lifetime. And on top of that, it's not just queer folks, right? It's also straight people who, maybe their gender expression doesn't align with what it means to be, stereotypically masculine or stereotypically feminine. And these kids too, they've also experienced conversion practices that they're trying to change them into something that they're not. And so I think that the term conversion practices is super helpful because it's not just, again, focusing on particular experiences like, what we think of when we think of conversion therapy, like perhaps Garrett Conley's Boy Erased, which is phenomenal. And Garrett Conley also wrote the foreword to the collection, for which I'm very grateful. But that's certainly an experience, right? And it's an experience that I'm glad that the world has been exposed to. And, it's been in some ways like an entree into the world of conversion therapy, but it's not the only experience, right? And there are a number of different experiences. And so, what part of the collection does as well is it broadens not just, what we think of, or it not only uses the language of conversion practices, but it shows it in multiple ways. And I'm thinking specifically of the stories where people's parents were their conversion therapists, right? We don't oftentimes think of, parents as conversion therapists, but what the collection shows is exactly that anyone can be a conversion practitioner, maybe is the better term. And oftentimes a lot of people are, and whether they know it or not, they are pushing people in a certain direction and those actions or those messages that they're presenting to their children or to other people definitely fall under what we mean, or what we fall under the umbrella of conversion practices. So I think that it's an important term to use because it gives voice to more than just the experience that we oftentimes think of when we think of conversion therapy.
I'm glad you bring that up, because one of the things two of the things I guess I would say that I really appreciated about the collection is it was very eye-opening for me in many regards, but particularly I found the number one, I was really intrigued by the idea that a lot of people, and I use particularly like a lot of maybe deconstructing Christians or people who grew up very evangelical, were and not just them, but particularly that's a big chunk of our audience. And a lot of those folks, as your collection highlights, were subjected to these kinds of practices pretty heavily, and may not have even noticed, may not have recognized until later in life that, oh wait, I did a whole conversion program and I'm only figuring it out 10 years later. And the implications of that for a queer individual are incredible. Coming to terms with that is something that I had just never considered. I kind of always imagined it as people recognizing very immediately what they were going through, but that's not the case at all, and that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And I also really appreciated, I want to highlight to you that this collection was the first time, at least in my life, and I come from a mental health background. I spent several years doing casework, and this was the first time I had ever seen licensed professionals taking part in this kind of work. That was a very jarring moment for me when I realized, I went back, I remember very specifically one of the stories covers an LPC, a licensed practical counselor, one of the highest levels of practice you can accomplish, participating in this kind of work. And I went back earlier in the story to make sure I had read their credentials correctly, because I couldn't believe it. I just could not believe that someone who went through all that licensure and training would still be participating in this. And through your collection, I discovered, yes, they will. And oftentimes they will use that background, that credential, to shield themselves from having people see what they're really doing. And so I wanted to highlight that, just because I bet after our conversation today, there will be a lot of folks out there who kind of look back on their life and go, oh dear, okay, that was not what I thought it was. And that's okay. That's part of the reason that we wanted to have this interview with Luke, is because that's something we didn't really recognize, and he kind of opened our eyes to with this collection. And then likewise, that I know I tend to say, like, make sure you look for a licensed counselor, check their credentials. I feel like I may have put too much stock in that. Maybe now we have to do even more reading on these people that we entrust with our feelings and our mental health. So I want to make sure that we correct that record too.
But you know what? And even on that, the idea of like looking back and not realizing what you went through as conversion therapy, that's part of why I oftentimes question the statistics on conversion therapy and people, the prevalence of these practices. That there are different studies. The Williams Institute at UCLA in the US. There's a number of studies coming out of Canada right now, or have come out recently, and they talk about the prevalence of conversion practices. And oftentimes it's like 1 out of 10 queers in, or pardon me, 1 out of 10 queers in Canada is what the most recent research is saying. And with that, I just think to myself, like, I think it's much more, right? Because people don't oftentimes see what they went through as conversion therapy. I think about my experience. I went to Liberty University, the world's largest evangelical university, founded by the one and only Jerry Falwell. And yeah,
sorry, couldn't resist.
And so when I went there, I graduated after 4 years of, well, undergrad, if we can call that, an undergrad. But I also went through 4 years of conversion therapy there. And when I went to grad school, I was talking with a friend and I was describing what, I went through and specifically talking about, that I talked with the pastor, because that's always how I framed it. I talked with the pastor. Pastor Dane Emmerich was his name. And I always said that, it was just like biblical counseling or pastoral counseling. And then after, she asked the person I was talking to, she asked a few questions. She's like, oh, so then you went through conversion therapy. And I was like, I guess so. Like I'd never thought about it in those terms. And when I finally thought about it, and again, hearing, someone else offer her feedback, um, it 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 just offered a new perspective and it put it in terms that I had never really considered. And I knew what conversion therapy was, but I didn't think of myself as having gone through it. And then when I did a little bit of digging, and I mean like the slightest amount of digging, I realized very quickly that absolutely I went through conversion therapy. And so that's why I do question and sort of trouble those statistics that are offered. And I just think to myself that I think, there have, because people don't self-report, because a number of people who have undergone conversion therapy won't report it, especially if they're still in religious communities, or they're still, they still believe, that it worked. And meanwhile, there's, obviously no evidence that it worked in their, both in general in the research sense, but also in their own lives. I think that because, again, there's people who are still in it, people who still believe it, and then on top of that, people who don't understand that their experience, constitutes definitional conversion practices. I think that the stats would be much higher, if we had proper numbers, but we never will, I don't think, just because of the nature of what we're talking about. And that, again, not most people, pardon me, a number of people who have gone through it just will never understand their experience as conversion practice or conversion therapy, right?
And you touch on something here that I also wanted to talk about, because you mentioned that because this is another thing that was sort of eye-opening to me coming into this text. I had, and I would bet a fair number of our audience too kind of had the idea of conversion therapy or conversion practice as something that is predominantly implemented on young people, teenagers, or kind of that transitional age, maybe even. I don't necessarily know how young they'd go. I maybe don't want to know. But in reality, going through your collection, I was really taken aback by how many adults were going through this with, and I mean, I guess you can't say full consent as to what they were going through, because a lot of this is hidden under, a lot of the unethical practice is hidden under very covert cover up language. But all the same, the number of adults coming through these types of programs was remarkable to me, because I just don't think that you consider that socially when you consider the idea of conversion therapy. So would you say and I mean, you don't have to have exact statistics, obviously, but do you think that there's maybe, would you say it is predominantly a practice that's implemented on young people, or is it maybe an equal split between young people and adults who do this? And maybe does it look a little bit different, as you move across the lifespan?
There certainly are kids who undergo conversion practices, right? But oftentimes people don't really start expressing their sexuality in a way that is explicit until they're teenagers, right? And like, I guess for any parent who's like concerned about their kids' gender expression, and then thus their gender identity, they might put their kids in to conversion therapy, right, to sort of straighten them out or to make them align with, again, the heteronormative model. But I think that really you're going to start seeing increased cases of conversion practices once a kid is no longer a kid, or at least reaching teenagehood. But I think a lot of folks undergo conversion practices when they're adults, right? Like, and I don't, I should say, right now that I don't have the numbers for the split, but I would assume that it was, that you're really going to see an increase, not so much with children, but with teenagers, and then sort of an exponential number, not exponential number, but like an increased number after that. And I think that one thing that I will say about, conversion practices, and specifically about conversion practices with consenting adults, I always say, that you can't consent to abuse, and conversion therapy is definitional abuse, right? And so this idea that people will oftentimes say, like, oh, people have sincerely held religious beliefs, and that people have, they should have the right, or the opportunity or the option to at least choose it or not choose it, as adults. And what we see in the US is that a lot of states that have banned conversion therapy, they've only banned it for youth. So that means that adults can consent to conversion therapy. But what does it mean to consent to abuse, right? Like, what does it mean to, again, in certain cases, consent to torture? The UN Rapporteur on Torture described conversion practices as torture, right? So like this idea that we should have the option, who should have the option, right? To the option for what? For something that's psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, and in some cases physically damaging? No, like that's not something that we should ever have. And so this idea of consent and this idea of age, I think is complicated, because even the idea of agency in general, right? What does it mean that I chose to undergo something that actively went against who I am, right? Like, and yes, at the end of the day, I am ultimately the one who chose, to go into conversion therapy. But at the same time, with folks who are in high controlled religious groups, with folks who are in evangelical or white Christian fundamentalist contexts, who are consenting to this and are choosing to do this, again, it's not so much that they're choosing to do it, they're pushed to choose, they're pushed into this, right? No one's like, yeah, I want to, change a constitute a part of who I am. It's just, that's not something that anyone sort of wants to do. And what the crazy part is that for queers, we're made to believe that we want this, right? So for adults who are choosing, adults who are consenting to this, they're made to believe that part of who they are, just like, a natural part of who they are, needs to change, and that they pursue this. And so I think that when we talk about consent, when we talk about, agency or choice in this, it's much more complicated than I think a lot of people make it out to be. And again, yeah, at the end of the day, a lot of folks have, myself included, chose to do this. But at the same time, I was in a religious system and within this sort of context that was definitionally abusive, right? Like it was telling me that who I am is gross, who I am is dirty, who I am is defective, who I am is, needs to change, that I'm a problem that needs to be solved or fixed. And that for me, I think to myself, like, yes, I chose to do this, but at the same time, had I not been in that context, that never would have been my choice.
And I know you highlighted like the UN engages with this topic. There's a long history with this. I'll actually tell all of our viewers and you too. You may have noticed it's just me today. Our lovely Reverend Jen is not here, and that's because we have to split a lot of duties on this side. And she's currently working. I feel Luke, you'll appreciate, on an episode about Anita Bryant.
Did you know that Anita Bryant endorsed my book, James?
I mean, it's an incredible read. I'm sure she did.
She came back from the grave. She came back from the grave. I did these little endorsements, and then Anita Bryant, Jerry Falwell, Fred Phelps, and Phyllis Schlafly. Those four, they came back from. My question is, who's running hell? But those four, they came back and endorsed my book. Anyway, Anita Bryant, save our children. Come on,
absolutely. And I was gonna say that was something I was gonna highlight was we had planned this interview with you, and then she's doing Anita Bryant and researching her, and all of a sudden, bam, we find our way back to conversion therapy again. Because she's like, it showed up in her story. And I'm not gonna you can watch Jen's episode to find out more about that. But I will say that I just hadn't realized how far back all of this went. And I will say I know one thing about your collection is that it is with folks who have gone through more modern practice, like relatively recent conversion practices. But how far back does this kind of conversion, ex-gay movement, how far back does this go?
Conversion practices were initially in medical and psychological contexts, right? That these were things that were, doctors were subjecting patients to. And this has been going on throughout all the 1900s. But when we're thinking about conversion practices in religious context, that really starts in the 70s. So in Australia and in the US were the first places where religious organizations were practicing conversion therapy, or at least starting these groups. And so in the US, it was Love in Action, which was the very first organization. Shortly after that, Exit was created, and then they had this conference amongst a few different ministries, and they created Exodus at that point. And then Exodus really is the one that we think of when we think of conversion therapy oftentimes, which was eventually shut down in 2013. But to rewind, I think it was started, it was either 1976, if I'm not mistaken. But really in Southern California is where a lot of this stuff was sort of picking up, and again, also in Australia. And then it just started to snowball. Speaking of Anita Bryant, she had a center, I think it was in Miami, where she had, I think in 1979, she created an ex-gay, ministry. And then Falwell, started his own at his church shortly after that. And obviously Falwell and Anita Bryant were, good friends. Mm-hmm. So until she got a divorce, and then he's like, bye, sister. And then off she went, and off he went, they split up. So what happens in the 1970s is really where a lot of these Christian ministries are forming. And then by the time that we get to the 1980s, then we have some crackpot, psychologists and researchers who start claiming that you can actually change. And so the Christian organizations, among other organizations, but largely, evangelical and white Christian fundamentalist organizations, they start buddying up with these different researchers, if we can call them that. And what happens is that they create this like sort of like symbiotic relationship where the Christians were getting, were receiving legitimacy because they're like, hey, look over here, like this, this group and this psychologist and this whatever are claiming that you actually can change. And then, of course, the people who are writing this research are then getting people to buy their books, right? So they're getting paid, and they're also, they have credibility, quote unquote. And so it becomes this sort of like, again, this like symbiotic, codependent relationship. And really, then by the 80s and then into the 90s, the X gay movement, and again, we put that in quotes, this picks up, and it's really at its heyday. And there are just this proliferation of all these organizations, again, specifically Christian organizations, conservative Christian organizations, that are claiming that you can change and that they offer these different programs. Then we get into the 2000s, it's still going on. But then we start seeing, a lot of the ex-gay leaders from specifically Exodus who are defamed, right? That they were founded a gay bar, or they were, or they just come out and say like, hey, this isn't working, this has never worked, and I'm not going to be a part of this anymore. Exodus shuts down in 2013, and a number of other organizations shut down as well. But really, the history of it is that, like you said, it's been going on for 60-ish years in Christian contexts. And it's something that I think a lot of people now think is done and over with. That there's no such thing as conversion practices. Right? It's not happening anymore. Today. And even though a lot of the major organizations or a number of the organizations have shut down, it's still happening, right? And the language around it, and we were talking before about how language is important, but the language is not that it's conversion therapy or that it's the ex-gay movement. They've changed how they talk about it. It's just gone underground, right? So it's biblical. I mean, they've always sort of called it like biblical counseling or biblical worldview counseling or pastoral counseling or whatever, but they've changed the language. And they use a lot of dog whistles now that for those of us who are like sort of in this world or were in this world, we can sort of say, oh yeah, like this organization is obviously practicing conversion therapy. Again, they're offering pastoral counseling for gender confusion or gender dysphoria or whatever however they label it. Just because these major organizations have shut down, or a number of them have, doesn't mean that it's not happening. It continues to happen, and it will continue to happen because evangelicals, unfortunately, are still around.
And I will say it's interesting to me you talk about through the 70s and 80s this kind of, for lack of better phrasing, unholy alliance between the religious conversion practitioners and the researchers in desperate need of a paycheck. And it seems like it's interesting to me how I just in my own understanding it almost kind of mimics or models or kind of ran alongside the like satanic panic repressed memory stuff that was there too, where it was like, I'll say whatever you want if you keep buying my book. Yeah, sure. That idea totally makes sense. There's Satanists in the basement, and your kid can be changed to straight. Like whatever. Thank you. It's incredible to me. That's again why you have to say titles are incredible, and they help us figure out somebody's credentials, but they don't always tell us their morality or motives.
Well, just like the licensure thing, right? Yeah, I think that that's another misconception about conversion therapy is that it's only happening again in certain contexts and mostly religious contexts. But 100%, like you have people who are licensed, you have people who are doctors, you have people who have whatever credential is necessary in order to, practice in certain contexts, but they're religious. And that religious conviction supersedes or trumps any sort of ethical framework. And I do think that oftentimes white Christian fundamentalists and evangelical frameworks are unethical. It's like upside down moral land, right? Like everything is inverted, but that's what's more important to them, so that's what they're going to do. So even if they have a regulatory body behind them, or they have the credential under their name or next to their name, doesn't mean that they're not going to do it. Why? Because their religious convictions will always come first.
And that kind of touches on something else I wanted to ask. And you also mentioned when you were talking about the history, you mentioned that the movement as we understand it now kind of got a dual start in the United States and then also in Australia. And likewise, one thing you mentioned earlier, and one thing I really loved about this collection was that there were non-Christian stories of conversion practice present in it, because truthfully that was your collection is the first time I'd ever heard that. My brain thought of this as an evangelical problem, and in reality it is very much, in many regards, an evangelical problem, but not exclusively, and that's an important distinction to make. So I say that to highlight, are there any like cultural differences in how this may play out across either like country contexts, if possible, like maybe Australia does things differently than the US, or across religions? And I'm very curious to see, have you ever found, and it's okay to answer no to this, I'm looking for hope, but there may not be any. Have you ever found a culture or a faith tradition that's particularly resistant to these kind of ideologies?
I mean, religious organizations, like within the Christian world, they're oftentimes quite similar. They have different models and different understandings of how to practice conversion therapy. Sometimes it's this idea of reparative therapy, um, uh, where it's sort of like fixing this gender deficit or fixing this, particular issue that is learned over time. But then there's other models. I mean, even the addiction model, right? The addiction model, how you practice, conversion therapy for someone who's addicted to being gay, whatever that means, is going to be different than other, other practices that understand, the root problem not as an addiction, but as something else like again a gender deficit, whatever it might be. So there are again differences in that sense. However, within Christian spaces specifically, you're not going to find too much variety. I mean, there are again a number of different ways that they practice, but oftentimes they rhyme or are quite similar to each other. Even within Jewish context, and there is a story from Jonah, which was a Jewish conversion therapy organization that was eventually shut down on the basis of consumer fraud, which I love that case. And in fact, the contributor, he was one of the plaintiffs in that case. And so that story, again, like there are different practices that they use. And so in that story, it's the story is called Psychological Striptease by Chaim Levin. And Chaim's story, the conversion therapist is asking him to like remove his clothing in front of him. And so like that I wouldn't say is specific to like Jewish conversion therapy organizations. In fact, you'll find that in Christian organizations as well. It's just that that was specific to his story. So I would say that across religious, contexts, you're going to find very similar practices, and oftentimes they parrot each other, right? Like they take practices or teachings or beliefs from Christian contexts specifically. And even if you think about like Joseph Nicolosi, who's thankfully dead. He was this conversion practitioner who was a Catholic. He was a Catholic guy, and this guy had a lot of really influential teachings. But again, regardless of him being Catholic, that was again what a lot of evangelicals drew upon was his teaching specifically. You can think of like one of his teachings was that the conversion therapist for young gay men, if they have a male conversion therapist, that gay man, that's a Freudian slip, that their conversion therapist, gay man, oftentimes, becomes he becomes a father figure, and that those who are undergoing conversion therapy see him as like a paternal figure, and then they project sort of like all of their anxieties and desires and all this kind of stuff onto that man. So Joseph Nicolosi says that like the conversion therapist is supposed to be a role model, like a father figure who helps change, right? So that's one teaching that was coming from him, but you see that across the board. So I wouldn't say that there are like major differences, at least in the conversion practices I've seen. Like there's, I don't know much about conversion practices in Muslim context. I just don't know. And in fact, that was something that I would have loved to have included in the collection, but there was, at the end of the day, you only can include what's submitted to you, and no one from a Muslim context ever submitted. But what I will say is that most of what we're talking about is really going to be quite similar. And again, there are different models, there are different approaches, but ultimately how those practices and how those teachings or beliefs are played out, it's really going to be quite similar, from one context to the next.
And that's good to know. At least that's maybe one thing we can lean on, is that it is pretty, once you know what to look for, you can look for it in a lot of different contexts. It'll start to, you, the audience, might after watching this interview, might start seeing conversion practice in places you didn't expect to see it. And now you know that you can trust your knowledge, that we have kind of a centralized understanding of the way they're trying to do these things. Of course, they're getting creative. It's amazing to me how much Christian infighting will stop when they can pick on queer folks. All of a sudden, the evangelicals love the Catholics. But, when 99 times out of 100, they're screaming at each other. The only time they're not screaming at each other is when they're screaming at their queer kid. Just out of curiosity, have you found any, like the second part of that question, have you found any cultures just in your research and your experience that seem to be more or maybe more effective or quicker to be like, no, we're not doing this conversion nonsense, thanks anyway? Or is every tradition maybe susceptible to this type of stuff under the right circumstance?
If we're thinking about more liberal denominations within Christian traditions or within the Christian tradition and then also within Jewish context, like you're going to find that these are not only people who don't practice conversion therapy, they advocate against conversion therapy, right? So if you're thinking like the United Church of Canada as an example, or if you're thinking of like Episcopalians in the US, not all of them, certainly. And in fact, there are obviously conservative sort of strongholds within these different faith traditions. But by and large, in like Reform Judaism, you're going to find more liberal congregations that are led by religious leaders who are, and again, not only not practicing conversion therapy, but pushing against it and doing advocacy work to end these practices. And so really it's just going to be in like the more liberal denominations. It's not so much like, oh, this faith over here, like Sikhs or Buddhists or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
you don't really see that. It's more so just like within the range or the spectrum of a religious tradition. The more liberal folks are oftentimes going to be the ones who are going to be resisting this. But again, like in a number of Christian traditions, even those that are a little bit more liberal, they sometimes hide behind their sincerely held religious belief that at the end of the day the Bible says that being gay is wrong. So again, that's and thankfully it's not always the case, but by and large it's the liberal folks who are liberal traditions that are pushing against this.
And see, that's incredible answer. Thank you. That also does though ring with some experiences we've had with other folks we've interviewed on the channel. Phenomenal Christian queer musician Semler talked to us a while back and mentioned that while they themselves came from a a more open, accepting, I believe it was Presbyterian tradition, they actually first started to experience that queer shame through youth groups they attended that were not held specifically by their church, but their parents were like, well, it's a Christian youth group. Obviously, what could go wrong? Well, a lot could go wrong. Even straying one church over can have massive implications for someone who isn't ready or doesn't know what they're being subjected to. So absolutely. And it's nice to know there are churches pushing back. Obviously, the more progressive churches across all faiths probably are. And it's nice to know that they're there. So
yeah, I remember when I was in youth group, I remember I went to an arts club, went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts. Like the writing was on the wall, like she was gay. But I went to this youth group and I remember I decided that I wanted to, after grade 9, I wanted to go into the dance program at the school. And so I came to church and I said to my youth pastor, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna take a dance class. And the first thing out of his mouth was, why? Right? Like this, like immediately questioning me, like why? And so the homophobic messaging, like we didn't ever have a anti-queer sermon. That actually happened after I left that church. But it was so clear whether like they didn't need to say, being gay is wrong and homosexuality is wrong. They didn't need to say that because the messaging was so consistent, and not just like, in regards to sexuality, but again, that you're supposed to perform a certain brand of masculinity. That was also clear. Like even with the question, why would you want to dance? Right. That's not something that guys do. And so it's just wild because like similar to Semler, I think a lot of queer folks, we received this messaging, whether or not they said it explicitly, it was very clear to us that it was not okay to be anything other than straight and to be, again, acting like a guy, or if you're, if you've been assigned, female at birth, that you have to act like a woman. Both these things are crystal clear for all of us, and whether or not they say it, we know that this is expected of us or was expected of us.
It's amazing how much of this is religious, cultural, and then some weird fusion of the two things that doesn't even understand itself a lot of the time. Yeah. I feel like I want to hear your thoughts on the idea that I think a lot of the pushback that we are happily seeing against conversion practice is coming from a position that says it is okay to be both queer in any capacity and Christian at the same time. Those two things, or of a faith to a certain, but most of the time, it's, as we've talked about, it's Christian. How do you feel about that type of messaging? Do you feel like that's the best route, the idea of rectifying queer identity in Christianity? and allowing those two things to exist in the same space? Would you rather see queer people maybe breaking off from the church entirely and just being done with it and kind of saying no, the abuse was too much? And likewise, do you think maybe that it's worth it for a queer person to fight for their spot in the church just to have access to that spirituality, that community? How do you feel about that?
I mean, at the end of the day, if someone believes something and wants to believe something, like all the power to them. You know what I mean? Like if you're a queer person and you also, for some reason, want to attend church, go for it. I would, at this point in my life, never go back. And there are multiple reasons. I mean, not only am I not welcome as I am, but also I don't believe what I used to believe. And how could I reconcile myself to a lot of the intellectual inconsistencies of Christianity? I just won't. And I can't. But I think that, for anyone who decides that they are a person of faith and that they want to believe in, Jesus and the resurrection and all of this kind of stuff, sure, like go for it. I just don't get it. Like I don't get it at this point, the investment in Christianity or faith in general. Like when I gave up my faith, I did so with a lot of excitement. Like I used to always think to myself when I was younger, like I can understand everything about Christianity. I just don't understand the anti-queer thing. I don't understand why you can't be gay. Now I look back and I'm like, no, I don't understand almost any of it. Like there's so much, again, that I think even when we're just thinking of like ethics or morality, I think so much of what is championed within the Christian faith is a lot of really like awful thinking and a lot of really like awful teachings. Even just the idea of like conversion, right? Like obviously we're talking about conversion practices in the context of like gender and sexuality, but the push that sort of like coercive push, or a coercive effort to change other people and convert them is a colonizing effort, right? Like Christianity is allergic to difference. It's allergic to otherness. It's fearful of anything that is different from it, and that it tries to then therefore subsume everything within it and create, like even Jesus says, like create disciples, like little Jesuses. It's just creating more of self-similar, or it's just creating, how do I say this? It's just perpetuating the system and homogenizing everything in its path. Everything has to be similar. Everything has to be not just similar, but the same within Christianity. And so difference or diversity is not something that, again, Christians celebrate. It's something that they're fearful of because it pushes against, the image that they've created of God. And it pushes against the image that, really is of them, obviously. And I think that for me, like, how could I ever reconcile that? And so the idea of any person in general remaining a person of faith, remaining a Christian doesn't really make sense to me, but especially for a queer person. And I do think that you can read the Bible in a very positive way when it comes to queerness, right? Like, I don't actually think that the Bible says what a lot of Christians say the Bible says, right? But obviously it's all up to interpretation. And I think that it's actually much more difficult to have an anti-queer reading than it is to have a positive understanding of queerness within the Christian tradition. However, I just don't see the redeeming value. I just don't. And again, for a lot of people out there who are Christians and queer, phenomenal. Like, you do you. Like, and I honestly, it doesn't like in any way sort of rub me the wrong way. I just don't get it. I just honestly don't get it.
It's interesting to me because, well, that's one thing we really try to do on this channel, not to evoke recent memes, but we try to hold space we try to reach out to an audience of deconstructing Christians. That's primarily the people that Fundy Fridays appeals to, we found out. And we've always said, Jen and I, we say you deconstruct, it doesn't always mean you're going to build it back the same way as another person who deconstructs. And so that's something we like to show is that, some folks deconstruct their Christianity and rebuild a new type of Christianity. Some folks are more in your camp where they deconstruct Christianity and leave it deconstructed. It can stay down there and the parts don't have to make sense, and I don't feel the need to put them back together. And both of those things are perfectly valid. I am curious, did you find ways to, because the one thing I always hear consistently, more than anything else, even beyond the spirituality, is the community. So have you found ways to kind of replicate the community element of that you had in the faith? Because I know it's just non-religious folks don't have Sunday meetups. Maybe they should, but that's something a lot of people are looking for. Have you found a way to replicate that type of community, or did that not even matter to you once you had deconstructed?
Yeah, so for me, there's both the community aspect, which I'll answer, and then the other part is the faith aspect. Just actually like having a faith. that I'll also answer. I didn't, when I gave up my faith, I didn't feel the need to find a new faith, right? Like, so a lot of, folks who deconstruct from evangelicalism, they go to, sometimes more liberal, traditions within the Christian tradition, or they'll go to, sometimes Judaism, or they'll go to another faith. That, I never had that impulse. Like, that wasn't where I was like trading one in and going for another. I didn't feel the need to do that because I didn't feel that faith had much utility in my life anymore. I didn't think that, like, and I still don't. The only thing I miss from evangelicalism, I will say, is the sense of assuredness that I always felt like I had the answer to everything. I miss that. That was wonderful, right? Feeling you're like, what, I know, the answer to this, and this, and no one can tell me otherwise. And that was having that sense of like assuredness or security in like sort of epistemic security. It was a great feeling, but it was also based on it is a fiction, right? It's not real. It's not true. Like, I didn't know the answer to everything, obviously. And it was quite a humbling experience to realize that, but I do miss that fiction. But what I don't miss is the rest of it. I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything by having some sort of like, defined or institutionalized faith. That to me isn't all that life-giving. I don't really get the function of it in my life anymore. I understood why I believed a lot of what I believed before, but now I just don't really get it. As for the community, maybe most people, really thrive and desire community, and they want to have that, again, that sense of belonging or place within a community. And for me, I don't think that I, actively sought out a different community to replace the church community that I had, because I think when I left the church, which was really like when I was, I don't know, 23, 24, 25, somewhere in there, I was in this like deconstruction phase where I was going to church sometimes and then other times not, and was around Christians and then other times not. I didn't really trade anything in because I just went from where I was living in Ontario, and then I moved down to Nashville for div school and in this deconstruction phase. And I didn't actively seek anything out other than just friends. I was just looking for friends at my, in my new school and new city and all this kind of stuff. And I think that for me, in a lot of ways, although I didn't have that like defined community, I had, again, friends and, groups that I was a part of or whatever, that in a lot of ways, I guess, yeah, it filled that gap or, filled that need. But what I will say is that the community I did find, both in Nashville and then, wherever I lived afterwards, was significantly better than the community I found in church, right? Like, that I didn't have this community that was based upon like shaming everyone and then like pushing each other into a certain direction. Like, Christianity is always trying to push you. And anyone who does that now, in my, like, if anyone's sort of trying to make me do something or pushing me and saying like, hey, you really should be thinking, I'm completely resistant to it. Why? Because no one should be telling other people, how to live unless that their way of life is impinging upon them. Right? If their way of life is, messing with their, peace or security or mental health, whatever, yeah, of course, talk about it. But if it's not, shut the hell up, right? And I think that Christians don't really know how to shut the hell up. And so they just, constantly would sort of push you. And that to me is something that I don't miss at all. I hated that part of the community. I hated the surveillance. Everyone's watching each other, everyone's judging each other, and they're so quick to judge, and they're so quick to say, don't do this, whatever. And that to me, it's like an adult kindergarten, and I simply don't miss that. So yes, I traded that community in for another community in certain senses. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't sure if I was like searching for that or seeking it out. But what I did find eventually outside of the church was a significantly better, more authentic, right? There's not as much performance as you find within Christianity. Obviously, everyone's performing. Everyone has sort of, a role they're playing or a script they're following. But it wasn't so prescribed. At least it was, it feels a lot more authentic outside of the church. I will say that.
It sounds to me like rather than finding like a new group to be a part of, you were like, I just found friends that were supportive, and everything kind of fixed itself.
That's exactly it. Because it was, yeah, like, no, that's exactly it. What a good way of putting it.
Hey, I'll take that. I always find it funny. It's very interesting to me just because even though, you're also the type of person whose work communities tends to be built on later. And I think that's really fascinating. I always joke about I say this about our friend McKay from Jordan and McKay too, because he's like a ex-Mormon who knows the Book of Mormon better than anybody I've ever met. People like you, I find it really crazy that the church goes and pisses y'all off, makes you learn the whole book, and then pisses you off and weaponizes you against them. But they shouldn't have told you your rose-colored glasses looked so gay.
That's
Um,
it. Yeah.
I wanted to use that line. I came up with it earlier.
La vie en rose.
I'll
No, no,
say,
but that's
like
exactly
rose-colored
it.
glasses, that's kind of stylish for all these Christians to be wearing them. One thing that you mentioned, and this was specifically on, it was on page 11 of the book. I cited a few pages. But one line that you mentioned was that conversion practice has been a particularly slow-moving aspect of LGBTQ2S liberation. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that, despite everything we know about it and how publicly pervasive the knowledge that this is bad is starting to become and how strong the counter movement is, how does this stuff still manage to just persist, continue? What are the mechanisms behind its eternal cockroach like status where it just we can never quite kill this thing?
And I don't want to be that person who's like religion.
Yeah.
Like people are like religion's the source of all wars. It's actually not the source of many wars. But what I will say is that for conversion practices specifically, we are really oftentimes and predominantly tied to religious beliefs. And as much as we want to get rid of conservative, high control religious groups that really love to fuck up a lot of other people's lives, and also their own lives. These social ills, these social problems, these religious problems persist, right? And I think that because so many people, and again, if we're thinking in the U.S. specifically, and obviously it being a very scary time for a lot of queer and trans folks in the country, about what is it like? I think it's around, is it 11% according to the most recent research. Anyway, long story short, a significant population within the U.S. still believes, in a 6-day creation. They believe in, a literal resurrection. They believe in a lot of stuff that flies in the face of a lot of research and a lot of science, but they still believe it. And I think that regardless of the significant research on the topic of conversion therapy and, the damaging effects that these practices have, that doesn't matter to them. That doesn't matter because at the end of the day, what matters more is a very specific interpretation of scripture and a very particular dogmatic expression or, hold on theology and a certain, having a certain theology, right? That you have to have a right theology, a correct theology, a proper theology that is in accordance to a very conservative understanding of scripture. And so there's research, on how masks were effective in slowing the spread of COVID. That didn't matter, right? That according to them, that's against their rights and as Americans and all this bullshit. That it doesn't matter what research says for a lot of these folks. If there is research on the topic, it's almost like they go against it just because it's part of the liberal establishment. It's part of that establishment that's trying to work against, God and work against Christians in the U.S. So that's the problem, is that like there's this anti-intellectual and evangelicalism is definitionally anti-intellectual, right? That there's this desire to and seeming need to hold on to a very particular understanding of scripture and a very particular theology that flies in the face of research. And again, they're skeptical of research in general, and especially if it's research that is, backing up claims that go against their, homophobia or their transphobia. So I think it's baked into the system that these conservative Christians, these conservative, zealots are not going to ever listen because it goes against what they believe to be gospel truth.
That also kind of answers another question I had, but I'm assuming similar mechanisms are, because I mentioned, like, assuming, as I think we both do, that for the most part, these efforts are kind of destined to fail and are just kind of a ridiculous posturing. Nevertheless, folks in our position are still forced to grapple with the existence of people like Jackie Hill Perry, who is I am not going to tell someone what their identity is, but at the same time I have my doubts. And so assuming that we are kind of like, this doesn't work, so it's not going to work the say you say it was, it sounds to me like really a lot of these people are just kind of forging ahead. Even the successful, well, specifically the successful conversion attempts are just forging ahead purely on a desire to maintain that worldview. Basically, giving up their true identity is less important to them than maintaining that worldview that is so important to them. Would you agree with that? It's kind of the same mechanism behind those cases.
Yeah, Jackie Hill Perry and Rosaria Butterfield and these, ex-gays, these success stories, many of whom have spoken at Liberty University, I should say, that, for them, like you said, well, I mean, it comes down to really like, what are people going to choose, themselves or God? And within this system, of course, the answer is God. You're always going to choose God over yourself. You're always going to privilege, the eternal over the here and now. And again, these people understand their same-sex attraction and their, struggle with, homosexuality, however they phrase it. This is a here and now, an earthly problem that will eventually be solved in eternity, that in heaven, they're not going to have these issues. And everything's going to be perfect. They're living in perfect bodies, blah, 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 blah. And so these people, what's more important to them is absolutely, God over themselves. And they're always going to choose God over themselves. And, it's just wild because, like you said, yeah, like I'm never going to tell someone their identity, but like Jackie Hill Perry, like if you're straight or if you're attracted to men, then I'm attracted to women and I'm not attracted to women. You know what I mean? Like, geez Louise. And, there are people like Jeffrey McCall. If for anyone who saw the documentary on Netflix about conversion therapy, Pray Away, this documentary, there's this guy in the documentary, Jeff McCall, and he's the one who like holds up like the Bristol board outside of like some strip mall and is saying to people like, can I pray for you for free kind of thing? And people, and it's just this like grade 2 like art project that he has. Like he's like, here's a picture of me when I was transgendered, and always, and then and here's a picture of me now, or like here's me now. I followed him on Facebook. I was like, I need to follow this man on Facebook and see like what he's up to. And it's this constant back and forth this guy has where he's back to his like queer ways and then he's back to his straight way. And it's just this like, and then all these people commenting, like praying for you, like you're choosing the wrong like lifestyle, blah, blah, blah. And like back to the transgendered, I love they throw in that D, right? It's seeing him as like a success story, but clearly not. Like look at his Facebook, like look at his social media and the like public struggle that he has with reconciling himself to this faith tradition that is obviously working against him and not who he is. And then, going back to, just living the way he should and then living the way he shouldn't, quote unquote, all this kind of stuff. And so and then you think about like the changed movement, which is essentially like the new ex-gay movement. Really, you see these people who are out there like, anyway. All this to say is that when you have these like success stories who are ex-gay and then them claiming that, we've changed, it's like, you clearly haven't, like, and we know you haven't. It's like, it's like a little kid wearing his dad's suit. He's like, I'm an adult. You're like, like the rest of us know, we all know, but, and they know, we know, but again, it's this fiction that they uphold in order to again, affirm and reaffirm their homophobia and again and their whatever messed up beliefs that they have. Yeah, I find these people obviously like wildly problematic, but it's also just like seeing a clown like make like serious claims.
You feel bad for them.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like you're laughing at them. I think it's really just like seeing clowns trying to be taken seriously, and no one does except those within the system. They take it seriously and they believe what because they have the eyes to see and the ears to hear that that these people have changed. But again, the rest of the world knows that they haven't. It's just those within the system that I think use these people as sort of like shining examples of change, when again the rest of the world knows that they're just a bunch of clowns.
I also want to, and that also kind of highlights one thing I want to address, and it was mentioned in one of the stories, and then also another story that's present in here. I don't want to spoil it because I want you all to go out and buy it and read it and hold it close to your hearts. But one of the stories in Same-Sex Attraction that I liked that was alongside the other ones was somebody who had, and I have a hard time keeping the authors separate, but somebody who had basically not had founded their own ministry and was advancing their own ministry to try and do conversion practice. And I also know that mentioned in one of the stories was the idea, and I think it's kind of a persistent idea, that all of the people who are conversion practitioners are secretly closeted. And it's a fun thought. It's a very direct line of hypocrisy. But I am curious, as a legitimate expert on this topic, like confronting that particular stereotype, do you think there is any merit to the idea that a conversion practitioner is more likely to be closeted than the average person? Or is that stereotype harmful and maybe something we should try to avoid for one reason or another?
I guess in my experience specifically, but then again, encountering a lot of narratives about conversion therapy and talking to a lot of survivors and reading the research on these folks, there is a disproportionate number of queers versus non-queers. I mean, again, there are some people who claim that they're straight and that they've never struggled with homosexuality.
Those
And
are the
it's kinda
types
like,
I'm
you know,
particularly interested in. The ones,
Yes.
the ones who are successfully converted into it, I kind of get the mechanisms behind it. The ones I find,
Right.
I'm like, how do you get led to this line of work if you never struggle with it in the first place? Especially
Yeah.
because when some of them try to describe queer attraction and the queer experience, I'm like, this is the most homoerotic thing I've ever seen put on screen. And you're telling me you can
Yeah.
help me avoid. I'm like, I don't think you can avoid these thoughts, sir. Like,
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that when it's like, in the office when Mindy Kaling says to Ryan, she goes, "I'm pregnant," and then it goes to the confessional, and she goes, it's like they're like, "I'm straight," and then it's like, come on. That's what I always think of with these folks. But no, there are the people who claim that they've never struggled with it, that they've always been straight, and whatever. And then again, we bracket those people off from the ones who are like, "Oh, I've been redeemed and I'm now straight. I used to be gay and now I'm queer now, whatever, living in fullness and wholeness." I think that for those who claim, that they are straight, my question is always like, what's your investment, right? Like, so many of us, no matter what we do, I shouldn't say that in general. I should backtrack. For those, at least in academic context, like oftentimes what you're studying, what you're researching has some sort of a personal connection. Not always. There are a lot of people who, study topics and research topics that are very different from their lived experience, but a number of us do, right? Like, for me, there's a reason why I research conversion therapy, right? I went through it. Granted, I'm also one of the researchers who does other research on topics that are completely unrelated. Most of my research in the past was on the Holocaust, and I'm not Jewish, and I didn't, I'm not related to anyone who went through the Holocaust. But a lot of us, in a lot of ways, have a lot of research topics that we're invested in. Why? Because there's a personal connection. So you do question those who say that they've never had struggled with never had a struggle with homosexuality. I just always question, like, what's your investment? Why is this your focus? Why are you choosing this? And maybe there really are people, straight men out there, who for whatever reason have chosen this as their vocation. But my suspicions are how do I say, pronounced, right? Like, I don't think it's likely that a lot of these people are straight. Again, they could be, but my suspicion is that they're not.
a lot of screaming coming from inside that closet, I guess I would say. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think there's just clothes in there. Um,
Right.
have you now? Obviously, as time has moved on and society has fortunately gotten wise to kind of this stuff, and there is a pronounced counter movement, like as you're kind of at the forefront of. There's also been wonderfully a explosion of what I guess I would call queer affirming media that not only like affirms that queer existence is okay, it's not sinful, it should be celebrated, but also media that really affirms the idea that life as an openly queer, unapologetic person doesn't have to be the pit of despair and loneliness that you tend to be taught it is by conversion practitioners. Have you
Yeah.
found them trying to counter specifically like all of the media that's out there now that shows happy, normal, queer lives that they really probably didn't have to fight back in the 90s, 2000s, certainly not in the 70s and 80s when queer folks were either in films to be a villain or die. Whereas now that's not the case. There are a lot of pieces of media that center around the queer experience and aren't negative at all. Have you found conversion practitioners kind of countering that or engaging with it all? At all, or did they just round it up as that's all the same secular lie they've been telling you for years?
I think about my specific experience at Liberty, with different professors talking about queer media and queer representations. And, you can think about not just them, my professors, but then you can think about Falwell, the one who started the university, and his pushback against, for instance, Ellen DeGeneres, right? When Ellen, the show Ellen came on, Falwell hated Ellen. And I still to this day don't fully understand his like really sort of like vitriolic like disdain for her specifically, but he hated her. And she was obviously showing life for what it's like to be a queer woman, and it just sort of be like it was normalized by way of the show. Obviously there was a lot of pushback, and then eventually the show was canceled, but and then Ellen, the what's it called, the talk show pops up. But I think that with Falwell, with my professors, with a number of other Christian leaders and conversion practitioners, they're pushing against these representations because they don't want there to be that alternative narrative. They don't want that idea that you can be queer and you can have a normal fulfilling life. I don't know if like there's like conversion practitioners who are like actively working or like speaking out against representations of queerness today that are positive. Like you can think of like Schitt's Creek, right? Schitt's Creek, it's not even like an issue that's addressed. It's just sort of like, nope, like these characters are gay and that's it. And it's just it's so like not noteworthy that they're queer that it just becomes again sort of like it's just the way that the story is. Which I kind of love that approach to queerness. But I don't know. I don't know if there are conversion practitioners who are out there who are actively like protesting this representation. I mean, they protest everything, so I wouldn't be surprised. Like they're always out there, picketing or saying things, or going to like a town hall meeting and talking about how so and so is doing this and queers are doing this. But I don't know. I would assume yes, but again, I don't have any concrete examples that I can offer other than my own anecdotal experience. Which again, at Liberty, we talked about like Will and Grace and these queer representations that were obviously like demonic, and that they needed to be we needed to fight against these things and stand up against queer representation because it shouldn't be shown to our children because it's obscene, that kind of tomfoolery.
I think that's interesting the way you highlight it though, because I think that they do have kind of a split where they could maybe be like, oh, that's misguided and wrong, and we shouldn't be focusing on that, versus the other side you're talking about, which is demonic. This is an active antagonist towards our goals. Not that they're just misguided, that they're actively trying to subvert us. I think maybe that's something we would see, but I do think it's interesting that, again, 60 some odd years on, they're still kind of approaching the entire world the same way, and maybe one of the things that those of us who are trying to fight this practice can lean on is the fact that these folks are not very good at adapting. They can't change what they're doing, and we can, and so that's a big benefit we have. I am curious. I'm not going to ask you to name, because we're promoting a nonfiction book of essays here, so I'm not going to ask you to endorse anything non-fictional because that feels like it would be competing. But I am curious. Do you just as a researcher, a very well-versed researcher in this topic, do you have a fictional portrayal or discussion, like a film, TV show, or something that you think is particularly eye-opening or helpful or just well presented in regards to showing the conversion experience? I'll be honest, But I'm a Cheerleader is really the only one I've ever seen, and obviously that one, I would call that a bit more advanced just because it relies on a lot of like inside jokes and predetermined understanding. Do you have any though that maybe you particularly like as like good for beginners, or failing that, just one you particularly just enjoyed?
You know what? I I put But I'm a Cheerleader in a very different category. I'm oftentimes sort of like, what's the word? Like not baffled, but I'm always like, for someone who didn't undergo conversion therapy and then writes about it, it's sort of a funny thing. And again, like not to say that you can't touch the topic if you didn't undergo it. Like I think you can. Like, but I'm a Cheerleader. I think that's a really good example. But I'm always, for me, I don't really engage with the fictional accounts because for me, I like to listen to survivors. I like to listen to, what people who underwent it experience. And I think that those are the stories that I would oftentimes like privilege and put first before anyone, offers a nonfiction account. However, I love But I'm a Cheerleader. I think it's so funny. And I think that for me, that what's different between But I'm a Cheerleader and some of these other accounts that are like trying to be taken seriously as like representations of conversion therapy when again the person didn't undergo conversion therapy. Like I'm always like, why would I read that when I could read again a survivor? But I'm a Cheerleader. I love it because it's just absolutely putting a spotlight on the anti-intellectualism, the inconsistencies, and the stupidity of conversion practices, right? Like, and it's really just magnifying how hypocritical and dumb conversion practitioners are. Like they really are like quite unintelligent people. We should put that out there.
No one will argue with that here.
No. And I think that film does such a good job of highlighting that. And that's why I love it, because I think it's just, I love to point out the absurdity of it. And like, for me, when I write about my experience, like for those who read the collection, my story, I incorporate humor. I've always incorporated humor when I've written about the topic when it comes to like my experience, because in part I want to show the absurdity of conversion therapy, right? I want to show how crazy and upside down this world is and really just poke at how stupid these people are. Again, I was one of these people who, not only believed it, but then also, tried to, in different ways, like push other people into it. But I now look back and I'm like, yeah, I was wearing, I was wearing my clown makeup. I took my nose off, thank God. Whenever I write about it, I try to show the humor of it because I want people to see how ridiculous these practices are. And I think that's what But I'm a Cheerleader does. It was also really ahead of its time, right? Like there were not really, there was not much representation of conversion practices back then. And we're talking in the 90s, right? And like, yes, like Will and Grace had an episode that made fun of, conversion practitioners, and, here and there were other references, but really that was the film that started to put, a spotlight on conversion practices. And obviously it took a while for, other people to catch up to speed. But that's what I would say. I'd say that film is my choice for a a fictional representation of conversion therapy, just because it's so funny. And RuPaul Charles shows up. So like, we can't be upset.
I also love, one thing I really love about that movie was that and I know that obviously we're trying to protect queer folks here. That's our main goal, is to protect queer folks from having to undergo this horrible dehumanizing practice. But one thing I thought that was really interesting in that movie was, and highly encourage y'all to watch it. You've got 2 endorsements now. But there's a character in that's just that, for lack of better phrasing, is a totally straight, slightly more masculine looking woman. And I can never get over her breaking down and saying, "I'm not gay, I just look like this." And it makes you think, though, because like there is also in a cruel, twisted irony, there are people who aren't like this at all, who are probably, but I think about like there's probably short-haired women at church, getting side eye, and it's like, she has cancer. Like her hair is growing back, but they don't care. Everything gets tied up in this worldview, and all of a sudden now people are getting caught in the crossfire. That, and again, obviously they're not our main focus, but it's just a horrible and an irony that you can point out to kind of show how ridiculous and horrible all this is, that they can't even limit it to the people they actually want to target. There's so much collateral damage in addition to all the direct damage, which is why this practice is so harmful and has to be stopped.
Well, that's exactly it, right? Like, that's why I said before, that it's not just queer people who undergo conversion practices. There are straight people as well who, again, their gender performance or their gender, expression doesn't align with the stereotypical sort of model, and they are then, ridiculed or made fun of or pushed in a certain direction towards heteronormativity. And it's like, yeah, like I think that like homophobia doesn't just affect, and transphobia doesn't just affect queer people. Obviously, like that's the target. But like you're saying, there are practices or there are things that people do. It is affecting straight people as well. Again, not that it's the same intensity or the same sort of like, beast, but it's similar to how, sexism affects not just women, but also men. Again, it's always going back to this idea of like what it means to be a proper man or what it means to be a proper woman. It's going to push people in a direction that is just maybe not natural to who they are, right? Like all of us act in a certain way because, hopefully we all act according to who we are. But if that that performance of gender or that expression of gender isn't aligning with the heteronormative model, we're all in some way, shape, or form pushed to correct that or to change that and to align and sort of conform. And so I think that, yeah, obviously, like I'm not saying that transphobia and homophobia are like have like significant impacts on the straight community. However, in this context, we can see how it affects straight people as well.
So the one question I had, and this was one thing I just noticed a lot. Oh, I talked about how this is all Freudian, but you covered that because they pick and choose the religion, the psychological practice they want. One theme I noticed across a lot of the stories was this idea that that a lot of this generate again Freudian. It comes out of like, oh, your queerness, your gayness comes out of a bad relationship with your dad, or something like that. And then I think about evangelical parents. And they're not often, I mean, in the stereotype, they're not the type that do very well with being told, hey, this gay kid is your fault. Have you seen, that kind of dissonance play out with these maybe more overbearing, domineering Christian parents, all of a sudden being told, hey, you're actually pushing into this. How does that go?
That's a fantastic question. I've never ever thought about that. And I've been doing this for quite some time. You know what? I think that this just goes back to, I would say that evangelicals see what they want to see and they hear what they want to hear. Right. So if the model is that, oh, you have an overbearing father, or sorry, overbearing mother, or you have like a distant or absentee or emotionally abusive, whatever father, that some sort of like, bad dynamic, and ultimately what, that's going to result in, the kid being queer. I think that they're able to hear that, or maybe they don't even really hear that, because oftentimes like this is the messaging that's being passed on to children or the individual, him or herself, right? It's not really passed to the parent. And yes, sometimes they do talk to the parents, but oftentimes it's really, this is like the specifics and the nitty gritty, and this would somehow fall under the nitty gritty for conversion practices. Like I think most parents would probably just hear that like, oh, we're going to help your kid. They're not going to hear like, oh, this is how we're going to help your kid, or this is what we're going to do. And so I think that they either wouldn't hear that messaging, they wouldn't actually be, they wouldn't know that this is what's being said. Or if they do hear it, it's like they stick their head in the sand and they're like, well, yeah, that might have been the problem, but now the problem is really my child and the queerness. Like the queerness is always going to supersede, it's always going to eclipse, their, role in everything. They're not going to really take accountability, because why evangelicals just don't take accountability for anything, even though they all have these accountability buddies or accountability partners, right? They take no accountability for anything. I think that for them, they would just be like, they would either sort of like pretend like they didn't hear that, or they're just like, whoop, that, that's not the problem now. Or I think that they're willfully ignorant, right? Like they're like, even if that's true, that's not the problem anymore. The problem is that I have a queer kid. I think that's what they would go with.
So once again, just ignore the parts you don't like and move on with your bigotry. Like
it's like a buffet, right? Take what you want, leave what you don't.
So the last question I'll ask is probably why a fair number of people are watching this interview at all, and it's because of the changes, particularly because we primarily target a U.S. audience, and things have gotten pretty rough in the United States, especially in the past few months, and I think there's reason to believe that we could see a spike in some of these practices. More practices opening up. I think when W. Bush opened the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, and all of a sudden we saw all of this money being pumped out to these horrible programs, I can't help but feel we might see that again. And so there's a chance that our audience, which we love our audience tends to be very far along, we've noticed in their engagement with this topic, and we love to say that our audience tend to be leaders in this space, and we love that we have those folks. But I am curious on two fronts. Number one, how can folks who haven't been through conversion practice, or who have and have rectified it, like in their spirit and have come to terms with it, how can they, in your opinion, be best supportive of maybe a new wave of people who might unfortunately be going through this stuff when they come out, or even if they're in the middle of it? I mean, we have a lot of fans who have religious friends and family, and they may be watching someone go through this stuff but not know how to help. And So that's one, is how can the unaffiliated, or the, I don't want to say the unaffected, but not the directly affected, how can they be the most helpful? And then the other side would be, if someone in our audience is watching this and having that moment, I'm sure you've seen, where they're going, oh no, oh no, this happened to me and now I'm thinking about it. How would you maybe have some advice for those folks on how to come to terms and how to kind of self-actualize what happened to them with who they are now and having pride in their identity?
I actually love the phrase that you just used, come to terms. That's the term that I use, or the phrase I always use, come to terms. Because when we think about coming to terms with something, we're literally coming to terms. We're coming to language. We're coming to ways of describing what happened. And I think that's the first step for, again, for a lot of us who underwent conversion practices but didn't realize we did until later. We came to terms. We found terms. We found language to describe it, which is in and of itself a very radical act, right? To simply like name what's happening, to put into language what happened or what's happening, I think is super important. That's obviously, the first step. From there, I think it's, not just recognizing what happened to you, but also, again, recognizing the consequences of what happened. And for a lot of us, it is guilt, it's then shame, it's the self-hatred, it's, a lot of really negative affects or feelings that we have or had. And recognizing where they come from, right? A lot of this is coming from, I always say that conversion therapy is just concentrated homophobia and transphobia. It's just put into like one specific space oftentimes, not always, or a specific household or a specific context. But the thing is that, we didn't just as queer, young queer folks, or, perhaps older queer folks, experience homophobia and transphobia in conversion practice. We experienced it in a wider culture, right? Like there's a lot of transphobia, a lot of homophobia that's, pervasive. It's, it's infused and baked into our, if we're talking about the US, like into the wider US culture. And so I think that really recognizing, again, the effects it has on us. And again, not just that it happened to us, but what were the consequences of it? That's super important as well. And I think obviously, like, affirming, therapy, queer affirming therapy, art therapy is always good. It's something that we should always embrace. And if we have the ability and the means to do it, yes, we should do it. I think that's super important. This is to answer both parts of your question, both, what, if you went through it, or how do you want to support, queer folks who have undergone conversion practices. The number one cited, means of again coming to terms or working through, experiences of conversion therapy. The number one way of addressing it is really is being heard and having, supportive, whether it be friends or a friend, whatever, in your life, and then being able to actually articulate what happened, and being not just the act of doing that, but then to be heard and affirmed. Right. So if you have someone in your life who underwent conversion practices, or maybe you don't know, but I think a lot of us have people in our lives who have undergone these things, especially if we're in the US and especially if we're coming from conservative Christian context. But if there is someone, to simply listen, that's a huge thing. And for those of us who have undergone it, to be heard. Right. That's a radical act too, is simply listening. I think so often we want to talk and tell people that, oh, this is what you should do. This is what you should do. But just to like offer space and say, hey, I'm here if you ever want to talk. And I think that's a big thing too, that we sometimes forget that, like, if we're on social media and we are to make a post saying like, hey, if if you're from the church, and I was from the church, and I've done a lot of harm in the past, against queer people, or maybe you didn't, maybe you did, whatever. But to say that I'm always here and I'm always, I'm here to listen if you need someone to, you need an ear to hear whatever, if it's about conversion practices or just in general. I think that, making it clear that you're a safe person. And again, maybe that's a social media post, maybe that's a reel or a video or whatever. Or just making an announcement in church, or making an announcement, wherever, whenever, and however you do it. I think that for people to know that there's someone out there that will listen, I think that's huge. And so it aligns with the research on what's most helpful for those who have undergone conversion therapy is to be heard. That's the first, and again, the number one cited thing. The second is, again, like therapy and, also being a part of like a queer community and whatnot. But I think that for those of us who want to help, I think it's listening. And, this collection is in part, it's out there for people to read. It's out there for people to listen to the stories of those of us who have undergone conversion therapy. So in some ways, the collection itself is, exactly this. It's us asking to be heard. And we're hoping that, two people read the stories. But in a very personal context, for those, again, who have folks in their lives who have undergone conversion therapy, again, if you were to offer that space and you were to say, hey, I'm here to listen with no judgment, no sort of like prejudice, no sort of like what are preconceived notions, but just to listen to what happened, I'm always here. I think that's huge. And again, I think we undervalue or underplay the significance that can have. And so that, for me, I think I always say that, again, just create the space. And if you create the space, people will occupy that space. And I think that's a super important way that people can actually and very practically help those and support those who've undergone conversion practices.
That's excellent. And I want to say, as we're wrapping up here, just to highlight not only your work, but just your role as someone who has really created that space. You've talked the talk and walked the walk. You have, in this work particularly, I think, created something that could be kind of a nexus point for people trying to overcome or even just understand conversion practice. I also want to highlight, just as someone who has read the book, that you are part of one of my favorite new waves of people I've noticed in society, which is really funny academics, really clever academic folks who are not only brilliant with their terminology and the work they've done and how well versed they are in their subject matter, but also just know how to deliver that stuff in a hilarious way. Some of these stories are heart-wrenching. One thing I love about this collection is that not every story leaves you feeling happy. These are not all stories of triumph, but some of them are, and even the ones that aren't triumph based sometimes are just hilarious. Some of these people, you included, have an incredible grasp of the written word. And so I would say that one of the best things you can do to be an ally to those who have been in the conversion therapy space is to purchase and read this book. And I also will say, request a copy at your local library so that everybody else can read it too. Buy one and then request one. Do both if you want to really help out. So with that in mind, as we're wrapping up here, thank you again so much, Dr. Luke Wilson. Can you one more time give us the name of your book, your collection, and tell folks where they can get it and when?
So the name of the collection is Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy. And you can buy the book. I would suggest, if you're in the US, through bookshop.org. They support local bookstores, which I think is super cool. Bookshop.org, they're great because they support local bookstores. And then you can also buy it through Barnes & Noble. You can buy it through the JKP Books website with JKP Jessica Kingsley Publishers, which is my publisher. So you can buy it directly there. You can buy it through Amazon, but we all know what I have certain thoughts on Amazon, but sure. I'll leave those aside for now. And then you can buy it at a lot of different like local bookshops will order it if you request it. So you can buy your book there and support local. That's what I would always say. But bookshop.org is great because it does support local bookshops.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you so much, Luke, for coming on, for taking the time to sit down with us. We've got lucky enough to read an advanced copy of the book. It's incredible. It was enthralling. It kept me for a whole 2 days. And I really hope that you all take a chance on it and sit down and read it too. You're gonna find something useful in it, and I think you're gonna find some stuff that, even though it's a very dark subject and it's not always the easiest collection to read, you're gonna find some very life-affirming and very queer-affirming stuff in there too. Some stuff to help you as we push this mission forward to try and end conversion practice once and for all. So thank you again, Luke, and anything else you want to leave our audience with before we head out?
No, just follow me on social media. I'd love to interact. I'd love to engage and interact. So yeah, follow me, and I think my handles will be in the show notes.
Yep, they'll be in the description. I'm also probably going to be putting them on screen right now, so you might be seeing them on screen. But either way, you can also check the description of the episode to find out more about where to follow Luke, where to find the book. And otherwise, thank you again so much. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, James. You're a treat. You're a gem. You're wonderful.
I do my best. You take care, and we'll see you all soon.